very many slides. There's going to be quite a lot of talking around them. So, cable's rather tight. We just will see. Okay, I wanted to step back and look, before we discuss the future of text, is to think about really what do we mean by text. So stepping back to the origins of text. Certainly as a language, its origins were in basically pictorial representations of ideas, and it was used relatively fragmentarily, generally as addendums, notes on objects, inscriptions on walls and other things like that. And it then later developed into serialization of spoken language with varying degrees of alignment between the phonetics of the language and the underlying symbology that you're using. So the Western languages with an alphabet, you've got a fairly close alignment between pronunciation and the textual representation, which is particularly bad at that, but whereas in, say, Chinese, you have a more abstract relationship with multiple spoken languages corresponding to a single textual representation. But still, to a large extent, those were fragmentary. Those were records, those were documents, those were laws. The longer forms really emerged as a byproduct of carrier technology developing. So as we got paper, as we got print, it became possible and actually useful to actually do longer forms of text, but it is an artifact of the carrier technology. And the emergence of mass print led to a temporary decrease, actually, of non-textual elements of text. So once people were having to print things with movable type, it actually became more difficult to include illustrations and figures, whereas it is translated into the computer realm from actually the behavioural print realm and what happened there in terms of mass production. And there's a daisy wheel up there, which is probably the ultimate limitation as far as textual representations go. In digital text, what we've seen is, thanks to Unicode, really, an explosion of new pictorial symbolic forms. You started with art, I mean, that originated way back pre-internet and BBS age. You had the development of emoticons like Emoji, the much more complex textual things once you had a richer character set to do the drawing with. And then finally, emojis. And these are interesting because they're largely language independent, but actually, although they've been in existence for a very short period of time, there's already an awful lot of divergent cultural event-specific meanings attached to emojis. For example, the aubergine, or the eggplant, has already developed a fairly profane meaning. I don't know, there are more suitable vegetables in emoji, in my opinion, but there you are. And for the Chinese, for example, the smiling is actually a condescending smile and is actually a term of mild abuse. And in fact, you should use the laughing face in the line above if you want to actually express happiness, if you're Chinese. Mainland Chinese, I would say. Taiwanese actually have a different interpretation of emojis. Mainland Chinese. What you've also seen, as well as the massive amount of linguistic development happening in the textual form, is proliferation of communication channels. So in a way, the way discourse is carried out has actually gone away from the big long-form text and back to a much more fragmentary discourse. So it happens over multiple channels. You've got Slack, you've got Twitter, you've got blogs. You do have papers coming out and things like that, but increasingly you're seeing in disciplines, if you're interested in scholarly communication, communicating your ideas, certainly in physics, the publication that actually ends up in Nature is by and large irrelevant as far as actually communicating your ideas. It will already been archived and discussed at conferences and in a lot of other places. So the multimode for discourse is happening to a very large extent. What we're also seeing is, again, the reappearance of a lot of embedded context in text, effectively. So the text is becoming just another node in that complex graph. Some of that content, confusingly, is encodable as text. So you've got things like MathML and MEI that allows you to encode things that aren't strictly textual as text and embedding them within text. From a scholar coming to this stuff afterwards, what this means is actually trying to map this discourse, which used to be fairly easy. You could just read a few books and study a few papers. It's really difficult. And constructing a narrative that draws all these bits and pieces together that somebody can actually navigate is very, very difficult. And I would say that this narrative reconstruction is not just of interest to humanistic scholars, although it's a very essential part of it. Very important is also understanding the context in which these texts exist. Because so much is context and culture dependent and they're so fragmentary, unless you have this contextual framework, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But you not only see this in humanities, you see this in digital forensics, trying to basically, it's called timeline reconstruction, if you're trying to work out from the artifacts. Come back to me, people. If you're working backwards from the artifacts to a timeline, and in the sciences it's called reproducibility. There is a crisis of reproducibility because in a lot of cases the text you've got doesn't let you reproduce the science. You've actually got to go back and reconstruct the narrative from a load of other sources which you've got to track down to actually reproduce the experiment successfully. So this narrative construction actually matters across the board for scholarly communications, for humanistic studies, and also for things like critical narratives now when you're looking at text. So what do you do about it? Well, what I'm looking at is really looking at text interoperability. How do we get ways of actually mapping this and crawling across it? So a standardized way of referencing text and text fragments regardless of the source. Regardless of the source is the critical bit, because otherwise you could say, well, HTML does quite a lot of that. And then you look at the average HTML page and you've got DOM model from HTML, you've got CSS crapping all over it orthogonally, you've got a load of JavaScript fiddling with it, you've got a whole load of other things happening on that page, and the underlying text is pretty much lost in a mess of code. It's generally a spider web, so that doesn't work anymore. It was a nice idea, but you let the developers loose on it, and it was a mess. So we need to step back really and clean that up. So, and we need it just not only for citation and referencing, but also something that's much more machine actionable. So a machine can go there, get something intelligent, and do some machine processing on that. The origins of hypertext really were much more thinking towards human navigating those links rather than machine navigating those links, which is why they're a little bit short on the information actually needed to traverse those successfully. Long term, this requires things like persistent identifiers and some notion of a coordinate system or addressing system for bits of the underlying text that goes beyond just the glyphs that you have inscribed in there. We need to separate content from rendering. Again, this was what HTML was once upon a time. Especially for the born digital. It's not completely simple. In long-form text, if you're an essay, then line breaks don't really matter. You reformat it. If you're writing poetry, essays and line breaks do matter. So understanding the difference between those forms, the fact that spaces separate words in alphabet Western-based languages, but don't in, say, Chinese, also needs to understand how you actually address those components of the text. So it's not completely simple. The other thing is, I think this is where things get really tricky, is there are multiple ways of looking at any text when considering the structure. And a lot of that depends on, a text may be rendered in different ways, and you may actually want to reference it with reference to a particular rendering of the same underlying text. You'd rather not just have two completely separate texts with a link in between them. Or particularly an analysis of the text. So are you picking out things like named entities? Are you picking out linguistic characteristics? So you may wish to actually discuss and address that text in different ways. And very important is to understand that texts, especially digital ones, evolve. A lot of textual scholarship is actually about the evolution of text, language, and some movement of ideas between those texts. So a very critical part is making sure that you can actually version those texts and actually difference texts effectively. And that means this is where actually extracting rendering becomes very important, because you actually want to concentrate on the content of the presentation. Linkable, obviously hypertext and things like that, but not linkable just with other bits of text and other pages. The page focus is a very strong hangover from the whole print idea. So you've got images, you've got media fragments, you've got data sets, you've got IDs that represent people, places, and events. Those are actually getting back to the humanistic approach. Those are the important contextual things that frame the meaning of this text. Who said it, when did they say it, where did they say it, and to some extent that allows you to understand why they said it and what they actually meant when they said it. And this is especially true because there's a lot of embedded text. So anyway, all of these other objects actually provide you with the contextual building blocks to actually build your narrative around those texts. So they're just nodes in a much broader graph, a much richer graph. I think really that's where hypertext has ended up. The text bit has disappeared, and it's a big node and arc graph out there, of which text is one of those components. And for what I'm doing, certainly then inside the web annotation model and the prov ontology provide a lot of the glue in terms of the narratives are really about events that relate people and artifacts to properties, they change properties, they're created, they're destroyed. That's the sort of thing we're talking about. So what does it look like? I don't expect you to read all of this, but there's an idea certainly on the left-hand side. This is an example I did for somebody, starting off with a PDF, which is how most publications come out. It's a lousy presentation format, it's a pain in the arse to reuse. So how do we clean that up, get the text out of it, and turn it into something that's usable, that's mineable, that's got some longevity? So there's a process of PDF extraction. We try and extract the raw text, we extract the various horrible things that PDF allows you to actually embed in the text besides the text. And we try and clean out the formatting, we extract the links and that sort of stuff. Turn it into basically some idea of a base text, linked entities, and a load of formatting and extraneous information layered above it. Those are actually rendered as annotations on some sort of simple basic underlying text. The idea is then you can actually use machine enrichment to do some text analytics on that and actually produce a richer layer over the top to actually discuss that text. Actually take some of the named entities and people and relate them to orchids and things like that, because in most cases those won't have been linked up. So turn it into actually a much more certain thing. The idea is to actually try and automate that to as large an extent as possible. And then the right-hand side which says, okay, having achieved that, having got a ground text and a layered way of lenses effectively that allow you to look at it in different ways, what can you do with that? And really the two key things out of that, having got those basic lenses in there, is you can have multiple ones of that. But it allows you to have multiple scholarly narratives intersecting in the same text. A lot of what's done now with text scholarship, you've got a text and one person will plonk their narrative over the top of it and publish it as a single big blog that goes out there. And then somebody will do another version of the same text and it'll be a separate blog over there. There's no correspondence between the two. So the idea is we can take a common underlying text and then have those as two multiple overlaid narratives, you can actually start to see easily new correspondences between those. And finally, we start looking at multiple text, which says, can we actually construct narratives between different versions of the same text, or an idea evolving through different texts? So what I've put down here is a list of things that are happening in that area. So text encoding initiatives up at the top, which is sort of the basic XML that we're considering using for this sort of thing. It's a very constrained subset of that. There is a problem with XML, that it really provides a single hierarchical model for actually encoding that text. There aren't single hierarchies, so how do you deal with that? And then there's a load of various projects that are looking at text analytics that are involved with text contextualization, annotation infrastructures, and that sort of things that allow you to start to build this environment that actually you can use for text in the long term. Thank you.
Questions, integrations, collaborations? Callum, Les.
Ray.
Hey, go ahead.
I'm definitely curious about following some of these links, and I just wanted to ask kind of that the end of your presentation in some ways is the most interesting to me.
Yes.
The multiplicity of texts. For me, it harkens on plurality of meaning and
Yes.
entering a more multivalent universe instead
Yes,
of
very
the
much
kind of top-down. So just curious what your thoughts or hopes are in that area.
Well, a lot of this comes from working in humanities, where what you're dealing with is not absolute truth, you're dealing with knowledge models, so there's always conflicting data. So what you really want to do is say, coincident on this document or collection of documents, there are several alternative narratives depending who you believe, which evidence set you need to accept, things like that. The idea of this is to allow you to actually traverse those and say, okay, I've come down Professor X's explanation, I've arrived at a set of documents, and now I want to see what Professor Y thinks about this, or whatever. So the idea is there to allow multiple coincidence and possibly contradictory narratives. The big problem with a lot of stuff that's certainly was done with big data is if you try and push all the contradictory assertions into one block and query it, then basically it dies. So a lot of this is, if you contextualize those contradictory assertions, separate wordings go inside this text, you can query each one of those in a rational way and get predictable results and do inference on those. So that's very much the end game. I mean, this is not just humanities, but also things like text mining, publications, and other things like that. We're seeing a lot of those applications coming in there. And that's why PDF was actually the general example. Most of the humanists and easy to map XML to XML. Getting PDF into something rational is much more difficult. So we chose the hard one first.
Professor Les.
So you start off by criticising what developers do to text, which fair dues.
No, just to HTML, just to the web browser.
Oh, absolutely, but sort of having to try to decompose a set of tables or divs. Please no. However, surely exactly the same thing happens when you try to provide, sort of semantically lovely markup for all the kinds of things you say. You end up with text in drag, and it's still very difficult to tell what's the, what is the text.
Well, this is the work which says if we can stop people trying to basically, at the moment, everything arrives in a single big blob. That's the way a lot of stuff happens. So everything's in, you've got probably 6 or 7 different logical layers compressed into one TDI representation. And actually, if you look at the spec, you should be able to decompose those and say there is a ground text. I'm probably saying about 50% of the stuff, to be honest. But you can say that there's a ground bare text, which has minimal markup you can get out of it. And then layer various sort of bits and pieces over the top. There are some fields where it works very well. Linguistics is very doable. Linguistic analysis of text works very well.
Callum, I hope you have a
Other
really
ones a
quick
bit more
question. This covered?
I have a
Really?
quick question.
Really quick one, please.
So, have you looked at the open hyperdocument system of Douglas Engelbart? Because the multiple lens things really reminds me of that.
It is, and in a way I'm saying, a lot of this is not critically necessarily new, it's simply doing it.
Thank you.